Hello and welcome to the third lesson in our English language writing GCSE series. If you're about to sit your GCSE exams, going to do that next year or the year after that, you're probably in a good place to learn a bit more about how to write well. This is one of the biggest parts of the GCSE course. Some schools do a fantastic job of teaching this. Other schools do a terrible job, to be honest. It's also one of the most fun parts, just creative writing. It's great to just sit down and create stories and narratives and just express yourself. It's written art. So if that's something you enjoy, then this lesson hopefully will be for you, because we're going through how to write well. In the first lesson that we did together, if you haven't seen that video, highly recommend it. We're talking about we talked about character arcs and narrative types. Last week, we spoke about the 5 senses and something called FOPPS, which is all to do with structure. This week, we're going to be talking about flesh and bones, which is what I recommend for being able to plan out a story. We're likely also going to just about get into the first model answer. If not, then that will be next week. So we'll see how that goes. But so just diving straight into flesh and bones, all of my students already know about this. So some of this will be revisory, hopefully for you as well. Flesh and bones, I use this term metaphorically because I think it's one of the easiest ways to work out how to create a story. So you actually start with the bones, which I know is a bit confusing because it's flesh first, then bones, but you start with the bones. So what are bones? They're this underlying structure to our bodies and to the bodies of other creatures that gives it its rough sort of shape and size, which then is built upon by the flesh, which is your muscles and tendons and skin and all that good stuff, right? And so with a story, that's what you need to do as well. You need to start with creating kind of an outline and a skeleton, which is this Freytag pyramid that we're going to talk about in a second, this image. And then you need to add detail and flesh to that. So what I thought I would do is explain what these different bits of the story are, and then give you some tips on how to write these different bits of the storyline. So in a nutshell, you've got exposition, you've got rising action, you've got conflict, you've got falling action, and you've got this fancy French word, denouement. So Freytag pyramids, these are the bones of the story. You need to have an idea of what your exposition will look like. So your exposition, the word expose, right, means to sort of reveal. This is what you're doing at the beginning of any good story. You're exposing your reader or your audience to the characters, to the setting, to the scenario, what's going on, that sort of thing. And you're hopefully doing it in a fairly creative way, something a bit more interesting. This is why I started with character arcs and narrative types and 5 senses and FOPPS, because you need like interesting characters. So maybe you start with your protagonist, but they're a bit quirky, a bit interesting, maybe a bit funny, something different about them that adds mystery. You're immersing the reader into that world straight away. And this will make or break whether someone will actually read your story or not. And, an examiner is going to be made to read your story, even if it's not very good. But what will make them enjoy it and give you the highest marks is if the exposition as a foundation is done well. The other thing you can do, which is a great tip for GCSEs, I think, is put a bit of extra focus on the setting. Make the setting just that little bit more vivid, a little bit more colorful, that little bit more unusual than you have in previous practice stories leading up to the GCSEs. It's definitely worth it. Just a few interesting, striking moments can be really good. The other option is just set it somewhere totally, insane. Ideally, I've said in the past, ideally, I want you to write about what you already know about. So, if you're going to go down that route, I would say try and think of the craziest place that still makes sense for it to be a setting. You might be bound depending on what actually comes up in the GCSE, because sometimes it will be a setting picture, photo. So if that's the case, then obviously you have to try and at least roughly base it on that photo, especially if the question says base it on this. So anyway, that's the exposition, characters, setting, what's going on. Rising action, well, once we know what the scenario is for your characters, then we need to go into We need to go into where they're going, what they're doing, what their objectives are, that sort of thing. And that's all leading up towards the climax, which is sort of the biggest moment in the story. So one of the big things about rising action is think of rising action as the part of the story where you're going to be putting obstacles in the way of your reader, or sorry, of the characters that your reader will read. Don't put obstacles in the way of the reader, to make it nice and easy for the reader. So let's just say that I did a piece of writing with a student the other day, actually, where the image I gave them, who was it? I can't remember. Anyway, the image I gave them was of a cliff. And so they wrote a quest narrative, which is a sort of a hero's journey of climbing to the top of the cliff. So, you know, it would be a very boring story if you just climb to the top of the cliff and, you know, that's it. Just like, yep, up to the top, cool. Yeah, you know, very boring. You have to add obstacles. So I think that they all added that a bit of rock fell down and like smacked the climber on the head and sort of dizzied them for a minute. And, you know, then there was a bird of prey, like just sort of circling around thinking that the climber was going to die, and it started to freak him out. The character started to freak the character out, things like that. So just adding these obstacles of interest, that's where the rising action comes in. Make these things, and ideally, as you build to the climax, make the obstacles bigger and bigger, and make the odds of your characters actually overcoming the obstacles or overcoming whatever comes before the climax, make it seem as if it's not going to happen. Make it seem as if the odds are not in their favor and it's impossible. Readers love that sort of tension or that suspense of not knowing. That's rising action. Then you've got the climax. So this is the peak of the story. This is where the hero meets the villain, or, you know, where the character gets to, you know, have a go at achieving their goal or their dream or whatever it is in your story. And this should be the most vivid, action-packed bit. This should be like the sweet spot, really, of the entire story. This should be the most engaging, the most interesting, the bit that you've been building up to, ultimately, right? Which is exactly why this Freytag pyramid looks the way it does. You start quite flat, just explaining who is in the story and what they look like and where they are and what's going on. It's quite flat. Then you build ever rising obstacles as they try and get to their final destination or their whatever they're there for. And then you get to the peak, the climax. Then you have the falling action. So this is the immediate aftermath of whatever has been going on in the story. So, you know, just doing a classic like superhero thing, you know, the superhero faces the supervillain, they fight, and the supervillain is defeated and then flies off and says, I'll be back, or whatever. So it's just whatever happens directly after the climax is finished. And then finally the denouement. That's a fancy French word for the wrapping up or the tying up. Some pyramids actually finish with the word catastrophe. So if it's a tragedy or a tragic story, it might not be tied up. It might actually be left wide open and scary and, you know, sad and depressing. You know, a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies end with everyone dying, right? So it's kind of wrapped up, but it's also like really a catastrophe and sad. So think about the type of story you're writing as to what kind of an ending you want. And we'll get into the tips now, but that's the main thing of what a denouement is. A denouement is just the wrapping up. So let's talk about some tips on how to do this better. So let's start with exposition. So as I said, exposition is where you're introducing characters and theme and setting, all that good stuff. So you want to try to build a specific scenario. So as you're sort of putting together these bones of your story and then beginning to flesh them out, what you want is to have a pretty specific scenario that you're writing about. So the problem with a lot of students that I notice is that they'll start with like, oh yeah, it's just going to be like, I don't know, a roller coaster ride or something. But they're not very specific as they start to just dive in and write. They don't plan. You do need to plan 10 minutes ideally. But as you're going through the story, you need to be quite specific of what's going to happen. And that goes all the way down into the denouement that we'll get to at the end. But so have a pretty specific scenario of where you want your characters to go, what you want them to do, what you want to happen. That's the most important thing, even as you're exposing at the beginning. Set up a vivid place and time. I sort of already said that. Vivid settings, vivid scenarios are going to be way more exam friendly. The other reason why they're more exam friendly is because if it's really vivid, then it can make sense how it all blows up in like 5 minutes, which is exactly what you need, because you've only got 45 minutes to an hour, depending on your exam board, to write this story. So you can't have like this enormous narrative of all kinds of crazy things happening, sadly. So make it very intense is another tip I would give you straight away. Reveal intriguing character details. So, you know, you can make the characters quirky, as I said as well in the exposition, right? So it's not bad for there to be just weird little things that your characters do. Like there could be a character that never takes their beanie on, no matter how hot or cold it gets. Or it could be that there's a character that all the time, wherever they are, they're just constantly flipping a coin, going heads or tails, heads or tails. You know, I'm just making random stuff up here. It could be one that only drinks orange sodas and nothing else. I actually had a friend who would only drink iron brew and nothing else, and I genuinely thought she was going to die because like never getting any water. Anyway, she's still alive, so that's good. So intriguing character details can be totally random, can be based on people you know, like I just mentioned one of my friends from uni, totally random. Or you can create things. You can just come up with a list before you go into the exam, even of just little quirks you want to give your characters. Create engaging voices. So your characters need to be bold and interesting and a bit larger than life. Remember that you've only got 45 minutes to an hour to do a really engaging piece of writing. So having vivid characters, over the top characters overall probably is a pretty good idea. Evoke a precise tone and mood. So this also links to why you need a specific scenario, because if you have a specific scenario you're trying to achieve, then you can evoke a precise tone and mood as well. So, you know, if they're on this type of roller coaster at this amusement park, then you know what tone and mood you're creating for that. You know, is it excitement because it all goes well, or is it terror and fear because actually it's a dodgy amusement park and the roller coaster's falling off the tracks? I don't know, your story, but try to make sure you use precise tone and mood. So all that just means is that the atmosphere and the vibe that you're creating is very precise, and you have control over what you're doing there. It's so important at the beginning of the story to establish that tone and that mood that you're trying to create. Think about all the stories that you have read or any of the storylines that you've watched. The ones that you typically love are the ones that give you a clear sense of what's coming pretty much from the beginning. So you sort of know whether you're reading a horror or a comedy or an action or a romance or whatever. So make the tone precise so that the examiner knows what you're trying to get, what you're trying to create. Bold, inciting incidents. Again, yeah, actually the story I gave you probably wasn't the best example, because, you know, climbing a rock face, a cliff, and then a boulder falling down, real original, right? Bold, inciting incidents might be a freaking UFO comes down and a tractor beam starts to try and pull the guy off of the cliff he's climbing. That's bold, that's exciting. So just be a bit creative with that as well. You don't have to go wacky, but go big. Yeah, go big, and then slightly later on go home because you finished the exam and you're tired from doing it. Introduce important conflict. So obviously the conflict more comes into, oh, I've put conflict here, I really meant climax. So important conflict will build to the climax, but starting off a little bit of what the conflict might be, even in the exposition in the first few paragraphs, good idea. Good idea. Adds more interest to the reader, helps them want to read more, adds to the stakes and so on. Rising action, it is as simple as what I've already told you. So give the characters obstacles, ever more challenging obstacles. So rather than going beyond that advice, which is really all you need to do with rising action, some of the stuff that we've just said in exposition also will help with that. So being bold with everything in your rising action and your climax and your falling action, everything, that's a good idea. But generally speaking, rising action is just the obstacles you put in the way on the way to the climax. So I thought I would just give an example of rising action in a story. and I looked at a few different stories, and then I thought, well, most students very famously know the story of Snow White, whether they've watched it recently, whether they've watched it in their childhood. Pretty much everyone's heard of Snow White. So, there were some other options, but I figured this is a fairly decent one. So in Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's novel, so it's called The Brothers Grimm. I didn't know that till today. I was this days old. Jacob and Wilhelm are the Brothers Grimm. Snow White, that's the book, obviously, and the Disney cartoon. The rising action occurs when the Queen's magic mirror warns her that she is no longer the fairest lady in the land. Yeah. So this is an obstacle. This is an obstacle, and it's quite vivid, especially because we know that the Queen, Maleficent, is very vain and obsessed with being the best looking person ever. So that instead is now Snow White. So the fact that she is replaced by Snow White is the start. That's a big obstacle that is then created, a big conflict, a big inciting incident. Envious, the Queen orders her huntsman to take her stepdaughter Snow White away from the palace into the forest and kill her secretly. Mustn't forget the secretly bit. Fortunately, he cannot kill her, but leaves her in the forest, where 7 tiny dwarves find her. They bring her into their home. Then another rising action occurs when the mirror tells the Queen that Snow White is still alive. So do you see how there are these obstacles that are being put in the way of Snow White through this section? So you've got the Queen, she's happy, maybe combing her hair in the mirror, like, yes, I'm the prettiest in the world. How crazy is that story? Anyway, and then finds out that Snow White is actually the prettiest. So Snow White is taken out to the forest and she's going to be killed. So this is a big obstacle, and they're like, oh no, what's going to happen? But then the huntsman can't bring himself to kill Snow White. So, but what am I going to do? I'm going to starve. That's the next obstacle. But then she meets the 7 dwarves, okay, and they bring her home, cool. And then the Queen finds out that Snow White still is alive, so she's coming after her. Do you see? It's obstacle, 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 interesting thing, interesting thing, interesting thing. So there you go. That's a bit of rising action for you. So then we're on to the climax. I'm going to just call now. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll do the model answer today, so I think we'll have to do that next week. But so we're on to the climax. This is the biggest part of the story. As I said, this needs to be the boldest, the richest, the most vibrant, the bit that has the most of the 5 senses and description and the most crazy tension and excitement and anxiety and whatever you're trying to put into it. It needs to be the punchiest bit, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be that long. It just needs to be really intense. So determine what kind of conflict your story is going to need. As you're creating the bones and then fleshing this out, you need to think about what kind of a conflict your story needs to have, or that you want it to have. If you don't have a good conflict, I wouldn't start the story till you do, because it won't build to something good if you don't know what that something good is. With some of the parts of the story, you can almost start to write it potentially and add to it along the way. Like the denouement, you want a rough idea of how you're going to wrap the story up, but as you're writing the story, certain ideas might come to you of how you want the story to end. So it's kind of exciting in a way that the story is a little bit alive in that sense. Like, you have a starting point, a seed of what you're going to grow, but then as you're growing it, you sort of get extra ideas of how to finish it. But with the climax, you kind of need to have that pretty well understood before you write. Decide what your character wants and then put obstacles in their way. We've already talked about obstacles with the rising action as well. Within the climax, you can put other little micro obstacles as to whether you think that they'll overcome the obstacle or not. So remember what I said, you want to put the reader in a position where they think that the character has no chance and then somehow does and overcomes things. Create characters with opposing values. So, if the climax is one of your typical ones where a hero meets a villain, it's really good to have characters that have opposing views on things, and that's why they're fighting or, competing or whatever your story demands. You want a powerful antagonist. Now, they might be earlier on in the story as well, but quite often in a short exam style piece like this, you might even not have any real antagonist detail other than maybe the name of the antagonist or what they do or something until they come in, and maybe they don't come in until the climax. So make sure that that's a vivid character, very powerful if you include one in your climax. Sustain the conflict's momentum through the middle of the story. So yeah, just remember, you want you want a very punchy story at the beginning. You want vivid characters, vivid setting, vivid everything. Then you want big, bold obstacles, interesting stuff. And then at the middle here, this climax, you don't want to lose your focus then, right? You don't want to lose that momentum that you've built. So it'd be really annoying if you had this great storyline and everything built up, and then the climax is just flat. It's just boring. It's just, kind of like that story that I said about, which actually we're going to need to redraft, that, the stone falling on the cliff climber's head. It's not enough. It needs to be vivid. It needs to be big conflict, keeping that momentum going from earlier on in the story. And don't be afraid to really go for it. You only get one chance at this, so you might as well really push the story and really go for it. You need to you need to raise the stakes, perhaps even higher. So, the dramatic thing would be like that the hero is like hanging off the edge of the cliff and who knows what's going to happen or whatever. So make it bold, and try to think of your story visually as well. That's a really good bit of advice generally. But as you're thinking about the climax, really think about how the climax is going to look, how the conflict is going to look, how it's going to be overcome. Visualize it. And if you visualize it, then you can add better detail when you write it. Okay, last couple of things. Falling action. So this is actually just a extract that I got from another website, which I thought was really, really good. So audiences expect a low ebb after every great tide in order to give themselves a feeling of relief. This happens with falling action, or with the falling action of the story or the play. In fact, it is the desire of the audiences to see the fruits of the labor of a hero or protagonist that satisfies them. If this doesn't happen, the audience stays unsatisfied and the story seems incomplete. Thus, falling action serves as a rewarding element in a story or movie. In addition, it is like a road from climax to resolution, and if the road is vacant, the story may end abruptly. So just remember that if you've got any loose ends towards the story's conclusion, that's also part of the denouement. As a matter of fact, I'm going to just tie these up together. The denouement and the falling action kind of work together to sort of bring the story to a close. The denouement is meant to make it nice and satisfying at the end, that everything has been wrapped up. But yeah, you need to make sure that any little questions that you've created throughout your piece, you answer them by the end. The denouement, the falling action, there's some overlap here for sure. You want to keep them fairly short and sweet. So you don't need to have like this huge long outro after the climax. As a matter of fact, it's probably not good to do that. The whole point of your exam style writing is create vivid, descriptive, interesting, crazy storylines, right? Not necessarily crazy, but just intense, vivid storylines. Get to a climax, get to some sort of big sort of finale almost, and then see you later, right? You don't need to do a huge falling action and denouement. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't recommend it. A few lines just to make sure you've wrapped everything up at the end. Now, why do I say that? Well, one of the other reasons I say it is because honestly, you're not going to have that much time to write out this huge developed story with all these loose ends that need tying up. You're only going to probably have 2 or 3 loose ends to tie up at the end, if that. So, it doesn't need to be a long thing. Focus more on getting from the beginning of the story up to the climax. Make that the focal point of your exam writing here, your creative writing. Make that the focal point, and then, the falling action, the denouement, that will fall into place relatively easily as long as you've got a couple of ideas of how to wrap up the story and either satisfy your audience, like it says, or leave them unsatisfied. You can see the leashes back there. I rescued a couple of big dogs yesterday, so I haven't really slept well, so I apologize for the yawns. So what was I saying? I have no idea what I was saying. So as you're finishing the story, you're front loading, you're creating this vivid stuff, then the falling action and the denouement. Yeah, basically just remember there aren't that many marks to be had from the falling action and denouement relatively. They're more into the examiners like me are far more interested in seeing how the story is just like vivid and punchy and descriptive and using all great vocab and all that good stuff. So just keep the denouement as it says there, short and sweet. Oh, and final thing, show, don't tell. So don't just say, you know, they lived happily ever after. That's really lame. Instead, show them being happy at the end, if that's what you're going for. Oh, and the other thing is, just remember, it could be a tragedy. So it could be that at the end, it's not sweet at all. It's short and sour, short and bitter. So just remember that, depending on the genre of the story you're doing, will depend on how you finish it. So I'll actually add that. It could be denouement, or it could be literally catastrophe. That's the other technical term. Okay. So yeah, that's all we've got time for today. Hopefully there were some good ideas in there for you on how to do a bit of a better creative writing. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please comment below. I will see you in the next one.